Good morning and welcome to Cardiac Grand Rounds at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. On behalf of Terry Messana, our CEO, and my co-chair for Grand Rounds, Vince Chan, it is my great pleasure to welcome Andrew Pipe to talk to us today about the times they are changing. A good quote from Bob Dylan. Cannabis, smoking, and vaping, what you should know. We're very pleased to have Andrew with us. As you know, Andrew is our former head of cardiac rehab and has a long history of drugs in sport and smoking cessation nationally and internationally, as well as being a former director of our rehab program, professor of medicine at the University of Ottawa, an honorary fellow from the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada, and most currently honored by being a chairman of the Heart and Stroke Foundation. Andrew, we're looking for an educational and interesting talk today on cannabis, smoking, and vaping. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for coming.
Well, good morning, and thank you for the compliment of the invitation to make this presentation. When I received the invitation, I thought possibly it was because I was the only person that was from the 60s still in the Heart Institute. And I would remind you that if you're from the 60s, you can't really, or if you were from the 60s, you really can't remember what happened there anyway. So perhaps that was not the case. So many of you will remember, or perhaps many of you will be familiar, may not necessarily remember, Bob Dylan's anthemic poem in the mid-1960s, "The Times They Are A-Changing," which was a plea to individuals in society at that time of great social tumult that they had better understand what was happening around them, because otherwise they would sink like a stone, to repeat Bob Dylan's words. And so it's probably appropriate to use that kind of context to usher in a discussion about marijuana, because the times, they have changed. And it's taken a long time for those times to change. I remember as a medical student in 1972, a Royal Commission examining issues of drug use in society was struck by the then Prime Minister, Prime Minister Trudeau, which recommended the legalization of marijuana. That was 1972. It's 2018, and here we are today. So it's also important, I think, for us to recognize that notwithstanding that there has been a very substantial change in the law, Canada already had the distinction of having the highest use of marijuana of any of the developed nations. And this data from the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health just points out that a very substantial proportion of the Canadian population have been and presumably are still current marijuana users. So as a consequence, if I may be permitted a prediction, that prediction will be that there won't be the tumultuous change that everyone has anticipated or predicted, simply because such a large proportion of the population are already marijuana users. And the likelihood of hundreds of thousands and millions of Canadians immediately rushing out to experience the effects of marijuana may have been overemphasized in the press and elsewhere. One can understand, when you look at this data, why it was that governments said, we have to do something about this issue. And indeed, this evidence has been growing since the commission, and the Ledane Commission in 1972. And you see that the use of marijuana is very high amongst young Canadians, but you also see that the consequences to the criminal justice system in Canada have been enormous. And the gray bars in the graph on your right show those individuals who've fallen afoul of the law as a consequence of cannabis possession, and the turquoise bars indicate those who've actually fallen afoul of the law as a consequence of possession, production or trafficking. And so one of the great impeti, if you will, of making changes to the law was the fact that so many Canadians were risking criminal records, et cetera, as a consequence of their use of this drug, which in 1972, it was suggested in the Royal Commission, was relatively benign and certainly less harmful than alcohol, which causes so much carnage in our particular community. So the federal government, in introducing their legislation and developing this framework for the legalization and introduction of legalized cannabis, pointed out that they will take measures to maintain and improve the health of Canadians by minimizing the harms associated with cannabis use. And that philosophy of harm reduction underpins, in part, the arguments for the legalization of marijuana. And as we'll see when we discuss some other aspects of public policy that have changed very recently, the harm reduction principle can sometimes get you into very deep trouble. But more of that later. I would recommend this to every health professional here today. This is a 250, 260-page encomium prepared by Health Canada, which is encyclopedic in its description of the nature of marijuana, its implications for healthcare professionals, and to the extent that it is possible, it documents all that is currently known about the implications of marijuana use both for the populations and for healthcare professionals. It's not available as a publication, but it is a PDF document, and those of you that are interested may wish to access this document and unload it for your own purposes. Perhaps a glossary is necessary because there is a complete language associated with marijuana use, which probably will change and transform as social attitudes have changed and transformed. But these concepts revealed on this slide are perhaps not necessarily familiar to all healthcare professionals. Pod is marijuana from the leaves or the buds of the plant. Hash is marijuana derived from the resin scraped from the plant. A joint is a marijuana cigarette. A bong is some kind of a device that may be used to facilitate smoking marijuana. A blunt is an empty cigar which is hollowed out and then stuffed with marijuana. Hash oil is a very gooey liquid made from the hash. Dabbing is the term used to describe smoking hash oil. Wax or butter is a form of marijuana that is very much like lip balm in terms of its consistency. And shatter is a very hard substance, a hard amber colored solid substance of hash oil. And so this helps you navigate the language that you may encounter as you discuss issues relating to marijuana use with patients. And therein, is a very, very important point. Never, ever make assumptions. And your assumptions about the likelihood of an individual using or not using marijuana are just that. They are assumptions. And I think it behooves all of us, irrespective of our clinical discipline here at the Heart Institute, to try to understand whether individuals have been marijuana users, a question that's much less laden now that the laws have changed in Canada. So what do we know about this plant, Cannabis sativa? And that's the most common form of marijuana, but there are other strains, Cannabis indica, a variety of other products that are available and that undoubtedly will become available as an array of massive commercial enterprises begin to produce marijuana in a variety of forms and of differing compositions to meet the needs of a market, or perhaps potentially more in the future to in a more sophisticated fashion, meet the medical needs of a community which begins to identify that there are some potential benefits associated with elements of this particular plant. The leaves of marijuana contain 18 different forms of chemicals and more than 100 different plant-based cannabinoids. The principal cannabinoids that we talk about most commonly are, of course, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, which has the psychotropic properties. This is the compound that produces the high. Many other elements of cannabis do not have any of those psychotropic properties, but in fact form the basis of those substances would probably have distinct medicinal benefits, though many of those benefits remain to be identified. And it's important to understand that when you smoke marijuana, when you heat marijuana, a variety of chemical changes take place, not just as a consequence of combustion, but as importantly as a consequence of pyrolysis, which, as those of you that can remember organic chemistry will recall, it involves the transformation of the chemical structure as a consequence purely of heating. And that transformation produces chemicals which are very different, which are then ignited and combusted. So that burning marijuana produces a whole array of chemical compounds, many of which are potentially very powerful therapeutically, and a number of which are psychotropic. So this is a very, very, very crude drug, which contains a whole array of chemical and potentially pharmacological constituents, the properties of which are only slowly being understood. And this is a theme to this conversation this morning, which will be repeated on a number of occasions. THC is by far the best known and the best studied, and is responsible for most, if not all, of the psychotropic properties of cannabis. Cannabidiol, cannabibichromene, cannabigerol are also other constituents of THC, which also potentially have psychotropic properties. But it's important to understand that as commercial organizations become involved in the growth, the distribution, the marketing of cannabis, that a whole array of different cannabis strains will likely emerge as a consequence of the degree to which the public, and potentially in the future healthcare professionals, seek varying forms of this drug or these drugs in order to address various clinical implications or to meet the needs of the preferences of a consumer market, which is now able to access these drugs as a consequence of the legalization of these products. I am not going to say very much this morning about medical marijuana. That's terra incognita. Despite the fact that a whole array, there's been a substantial public clamor for medical marijuana, that there are large numbers of individuals who take marijuana and use it ostensibly for medical purposes, in exactly the same way that there are individuals in our community who drink a bottle of scotch every couple of days for medicinal properties and experience effects which they feel are beneficial to their health. And now that's probably a bit of a lurid analogy, but it's not far off the mark. Because there are many who probably would not enjoy the fact that they no longer have the psychotropic effects of a drug, which probably are not medicinal in any way, if they were to rely solely on the cannabidiols and other agents which have phenomenal pharmacological properties or pharmacological potential. And there are hundreds, if not potentially thousands of compounds that could be constructed from the chemicals that form the basis of this plant, which have a whole variety of therapeutic potentials and possibilities. And much is to be learned in the years to come about these particular properties, and you'll notice that anti-ischemia is one of those particular properties. So if we're to understand more about the nature of some of these drugs, it's also important that we begin to understand something about the endocannabinoid system. And probably we're all familiar with the concept of endorphins. The fact that in our body we have this, we have this endogenous system of opioid-like substances which operate and attach themselves to various receptors throughout our body and perform a number of physiological processes. The endocannabinoid system is directly or exactly analogous to that system. There is in our body a system, it's ancient, it's conserved throughout evolution, of these processes of ubiquitous lipid signaling, I believe is the term that's used to describe them, which has important regulatory functions throughout the human body in its entirety. And the ECS system has been implicated in a wide array of physiological and pathophysiological processes. And the list is before you on this particular slide, and you can read faster than I can speak, but you will notice that cardiovascular function figures prominently, centrally in that particular list. And so it's important for us to understand some of the principles of the endocannabinoid system. And very simply put, we have endocannabinoid receptors, which have been very imaginatively named the cannabinoid 1 receptor and the cannabinoid 2 receptor. We also have substances in our body which are the classical ligands for these receptors, anandamide being most prominent and 2-AG being the second, and then there are a variety of synthesizing and degrading enzymes which operate to regulate the performance of this particular system. Well, knowing that, one can then begin to appreciate how it is that cannabis exerts its effects, how it is that cannabis may have pathophysiological consequences, but also, as importantly, how cannabis may have very distinct therapeutic potentials as a result of the degree to which cannabis attaches itself to either of these two receptors. So the cannabinoid 1 receptor is found in the central nervous system, the cardiac and vascular systems, and it contributes when stimulated to tissue damage. It's felt to play a role in the production of atherosclerosis. And so one can conceive that if we can block the cannabinoid 1 receptors from a cardiovascular perspective, there may be very important therapeutic opportunities. The cannabis 2 receptor, on the other hand, is the good guy cannabis receptor, and it's found in the immune tissues principally. And it facilitates healing, it reduces the impact of tissue injury, and so if we can stimulate the cannabinoid 2 receptor, then you will also begin to appreciate that we have a potential therapeutic agent and an understandable mechanism for its application. Very simply put, you see that marijuana very closely, or pardon me, THC, very closely approximates the chemical structure of that principal ligand for the ECS, the endocannabinoid system, anandamide. And even I, who graduated from medical school with arguably the lowest ever recorded mark in biochemistry, can recognize that something similar about these, which may have some implication for the role that THC plays in a variety of physiological processes. And this graph just shows, I think, more carefully the nature of these particular receptors with particular relevance to the heart. And so you see that the cannabis 2 receptors are found throughout the myocardium, and they attenuate a whole variety of inflammatory and other processes which we understand to take place in the development of atheroma, in the development of tissue injury that occurs as a consequence of ischemia, etc., etc. And so the cannabis 2 receptor is the good guy, as noted in this particular equation. The cannabis 1 receptor is also present in the heart. But this is a receptor which increases or decreases heart rate. It can have an effect on myocardial cell function. It can increase tissue injury, increase oxidative stresses, et cetera, and because of its pro-inflammatory effect, we can see that it potentiates the damage that may occur to the myocardium or myocardial tissues as a consequence of injury or insult. What we also know is that cannabis smoke itself plays an important role in terms of the development of cardiovascular problems. And here it's, I think, very fundamentally important to understand that smoking marijuana is virtually exactly the same as smoking tobacco in the sense that the combustion of an organic compound produces large quantities of carbon monoxide, it produces large quantities of various carcinogens. The difference being that marijuana burns at a much higher temperature than does tobacco. And as a consequence, the concentration of carcinogens, the production of carboxyhemoglobin, the development of tar-like products is much greater when one burns marijuana than when one burns a commercial tobacco cigarette. Now, the difference, of course, from a carcinogenesis point of view is that carcinogenesis occurs as a result of exposure and duration of exposure and frequency of exposure, so individuals are not typically smoking 40 marijuana cigarettes a day, as is the case with many smokers. And so there's a very quantitative difference, but nonetheless, there's a very substantial qualitative difference in the exposure that occurs as a consequence of somebody smoking a marijuana cigarette. And merely the production of carbon monoxide, et cetera, can have an impact on the cardiovascular system, irrespective of the constituents that we think of when we think about marijuana. And so exposure to the smoke of burning cannabis produces a variety of changes: oxidative stress, inflammation, electrophysiologic changes, endothelial dysfunction, et cetera, and that occurs incidentally in association with minimal use of marijuana. But individuals who have long-term, heavy, frequent exposure to marijuana can anticipate, as a consequence of those mechanisms, changes in their vascular health with the development of an array of syndromes or pre-syndromes that ultimately lead to cardiovascular consequences. And perhaps in a more elegant way, this particular slide just outlines the various processes and the mechanisms which contribute to to the vascular changes which ultimately find expression in a variety of cardiovascular disease states. Impaired oxygen supply, increased oxygen demand, effect on the vascular apparatus itself, in changing vascular tone, et cetera, mechanisms which are familiar to you all as you think about the implications of smoking anything on vascular physiology, except that now we have this array of mechanisms also in play and having a potential effect. Well, what do we know then about the consequences of marijuana insofar as cardiovascular health is concerned? And I thought, given that I was a child of the 60s and the 70s, and indeed was in medical school, during that time, I would go back and look at some early research. And let me show you this paper, or let me discuss this paper, which was published in 1971. And I want to draw your attention to one particularly important point. The marijuana which was used in this study contained 0.5 or up to 2.9% THC. And what they noted was that marijuana smoking caused a significant increase in heart rate in the volunteers, and the degree of tachycardia related to the dose of THC. And their conclusion was that the clinical significance of their finding was probably no greater than that for individuals who are susceptible to smoking tobacco or drinking caffeine-containing beverages. So pretty anodyne consequences of using marijuana in this particular study. But I would draw your attention to the fact that they said no different than smoking tobacco, which really harkens back to the mechanisms that I just described a moment or so ago. But recall that the concentration of marijuana in the study was 0.9 to 2.5%, I believe. Well, today's marijuana ain't your daddy's marijuana. And these images from the 60s, Allen Ginsberg and the Love-Ins and the pleas for legalizing marijuana, took place at a time when typically individuals were smoking marijuana of up to 2.9, 1.9% THC. And of course, a whole lot has changed. And because the concentration of THC in the marijuana, which is now found in our streets and alleys across this country and elsewhere, is much, much higher. And this estimation of 30% underestimates the concentration of what may be found in many commonly smoked or consumed marijuana products in Canada today, which is another reason why the federal government sought to legalize marijuana with the hope that they would be able to standardize doses and bring the levels of THC down. By way of comparison, the standard NIDA cigarette, the National Institute of Drug Abuse cigarette, which was used in many of the studies which examined the effects of marijuana, was 2.5%. And hydroponically grown BC bud, typically can have THC concentrations of 35, 40%. So a very different drug with a very different array of consequences for those who use this drug. But let's go back to the literature. In the year that I graduated from medical school, this particular study was performed in Calgary. Marijuana and the cardiovascular system, the conclusion of which was that there's really no data to suggest that the acute administration of marijuana presents a significant hazard to the cardiovascular system of those using these products. Well, flash forward to 2018 in this article which appeared in Nature Review, which looked at marijuana and synthetic cannabinoids. We'll come back to synthetic cannabinoids. They are in an entirely different subspecies and warrant very, very careful attention. And again, probably one of the rationales for or one of the arguments for the legalization of marijuana is that it would hopefully get rid of the synthetic cannabinoids which can cause such carnage in our community. But the authors of this particular study have a slightly different conclusion. With the legalization of marijuana, physicians should be alert to the possibility that marijuana or its synthetic analogs might contribute to severe cardiovascular issues. So we know, and to summarize again, we know that cannabinoid receptors are present in a variety of states and that smoking marijuana produces a whole array of consequences that might contribute to cardiovascular health. And indeed, in this study, which was part of that, this diagram, which was part of that Pasha review, lists all of the varying cardiovascular consequences which have been attributed to marijuana. And the important point to note in this slide is that the asterisks refer to the use of synthetic cannabinoids, which are 100 times more potent than the typical marijuana consumed by individuals today. So produce very substantial, can produce, it's felt, substantial consequences from a cardiovascular standpoint. Therefore, when you go to the literature, you are overwhelmed by an array of case reports, letters to the editor, et cetera, all of which tend to emphasize with some degree of stridency often that there are cataclysmic consequences to using marijuana from a cardiovascular standpoint. Who wants to have cannabis-induced asystole, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's very important to try to deconstruct this literature, and my attempts to do so is in no way systematic, but nonetheless I think fairly thorough, in order to try to understand what is actually happening. Once again, we understand that smoking marijuana produces these effects, which we know can contribute to increased cardiovascular stress and lead to, in susceptible individuals, cardiovascular problems. And so it's very, very important to separate the effects of smoking a substance from the actual pharmacological or physiological effects of some of the other elements that are part of the substance that is being smoked. Nonetheless, some researchers have looked at the impact of individuals who are frequent users of myocardial infarction, followed them and looked at survivability, and have suggested that habitual marijuana users who have had an acute myocardial infarction have an increased mortality rate over the following 18 years. But findings that did not approach statistical significance. Nonetheless, the advice of the authors of this study, consistent with the advice of the authors of many of the studies that I will show you, are that it's given the prior evidence of acutely increased risk during each episode of smoking marijuana, it's very important to caution patients with coronary artery disease and those at high risk of such a disease to abstain from smoking marijuana. It's been shown, for instance, by Middleman and his group, that within an hour of smoking a marijuana cigarette, your risk of the odds of your having a myocardial infarction are almost 5 times what they would be in the non-marijuana smoking state, and they still remain elevated 1 or 2 hours after you have smoked cigarettes. And so there is a lower anginal threshold in those with chronic stable angina, which is exactly what you see in individuals who smoke a tobacco cigarette. So very important to make that distinction. And when we begin to examine the impact of marijuana from a cardiovascular perspective, it's very important to understand that most of the studies find it impossible to separate other forms of drug use, particularly tobacco use, amongst those patients who present having used marijuana with a cardiovascular effect, because the likelihood is that many of those individuals are smokers or heavy smokers and may come from circumstances in which it's quite likely that other forms of illicit drug use are common. But let's look at some of these. The French have a very sophisticated system of pharmacovigilance. And so they have published a great deal about the impacts of marijuana from a cardiovascular standpoint, and this is one of them. A French soccer player. I will make no comment about the abilities of French soccer players, given that Dr. Massana is sitting in the front row, but this particular study involved an individual who was smoking up to 11 or 12 marijuana cigarettes a day, as well as being a smoker of other more conventional products, and presented with the findings that you see on your left. And so this was reported as an exercise-induced acute coronary syndrome, but with a history of prolonged and massive cannabis consumption. And this is not unlike the cases that are to be found throughout the literature. If we want to have a more nuanced, perhaps, examination of this phenomenon, this work by De Filippis from Boston looked at MIs occurring in all of those under 50 years of age at 2 academic hospitals, 2 inner city academic public hospitals in the United States. individuals who presented with MIs from 2000 to 2016. And their substance use was determined by self-report or toxicology screen. And what they showed was that over a 14 or 15-year period, the association of marijuana in young adults with myocardial infarction began to increase. There, I think we can all see that there's an increase in that particular slope. And when you look at individual cases and looked at those who were marijuana or cocaine-free or using marijuana or cocaine, you see that clearly cocaine figures prominently in all-cause death and in cardiovascular death. Marijuana, there are increases, it would seem, above those who are not using neither drugs. But 70% of all of these individuals were smokers, and it was impossible to distinguish those who might be using other drugs because, and with compounding lifestyle factors. And so once again, we see that fairly commonsensical recommendation that we should be much more alert when we see young adults with an acute MI to ask about marijuana and obviously other forms of drug use in order that that might be able to be addressed. Another very substantial study is the Cardia study, in which more than 5,000 individuals were followed for more than 25 years. And their lifetime exposure to marijuana was estimated, but the primary outcome of interest was the development of cardiovascular disease. A very sophisticated study, the conclusion of which was that neither cumulative lifetime nor recent use of marijuana is associated with the incidence of cardiovascular disease in middle age. So we have isolated case reports which suggest that there are some issues here, issues which one would predict and anticipate on the basis of any form of smoking behavior and possibly other drug use, and then larger population studies which do not seem to show any significant signal. And we can find this evidence in a variety of large studies. The summary of such studies shows that evidence examining the effect of marijuana on diabetes, hyperlipidemia, MI, stroke, and CV mortality was insufficient because the studies are not adequately powered, nor are they necessarily appropriately sophisticated enough to be able to distinguish marijuana from other forms of drug use. When we look at issues like heart failure, this study is rather intriguing. It looked at a large number of individuals over a 2-year basis, followed them to see what the impact of marijuana use was on heart failure, CVA, et cetera, et cetera. And they found that it seemed that the prevalence of these syndromes was significantly higher in patients with cannabis use. And cannabis use, that is regular cannabis use, seemed to independently predict the risks of heart failure and CVA in such individuals. But with legalization and potentially increased use, the recommendation once again is that further studies need to be undertaken in order that we might find more definitive evidence. Christopher France and Frischman in this, highly regarded review also pointed out and made the arguments in 2 ways. They said, yeah, there's some evidence that marijuana triggers MIs, and it's been suggested that those that use marijuana on a daily basis have a 1 to 5 to 3% annual incidence of cardiac events. And that case reports and a variety of other studies suggest there's an association between marijuana use and CVD mortality. They also pointed out, however, and this is a point that I should have made earlier, that there are significant animal studies that show that marijuana may have a protective effect on damage to the myocardium, particularly in the situation of experimentally induced myocardial infarctions by ligating coronary arteries in experimental animals. And that protective effect presumably occurs as a consequence of the stimulation of the cannabinoid 2 receptors. But France and Frischman also pointed out in a counter-argument within the same argument that there are several large studies which find no effect on overall mortality, prominent among which is a very large study, a 10-year follow-up of patients in the Kaiser Permanente California health system that found no difference in cardiovascular mortality between those who are marijuana users and non-users. And interestingly, they included this particular graph derived from another author that sort of sought to put this into perspective and looked at the odds ratios on the horizontal axis and the population attributable factors on the vertical axis, and showed that marijuana figures somewhere down here just behind having a heavy meal, but obviously way behind cocaine use. So lots of questions remain to be answered, and of course, given where we are, who we are, and the capacities and capabilities of this institute, some very intriguing research questions that we might begin to address in the future. I anticipated that there might be some of our anesthesiology colleagues here in the audience this morning, and I'm pleased to note that several of you are with us, and there is an emerging literature about the impact of marijuana use on pre and perioperative implications. And as you can see, they are listed here. Many of them relate to the irritative effects on the respiratory system as a consequence of exposure to just smoke. But there are also a number of questions about some of the impacts of marijuana, particularly in increasing heart rate, altering blood pressure, may mean that individuals consideration may need to be given as to the medications that might be used in such individuals. And the fact that such individuals may also have much higher need for analgesics both intra and post-operatively. And so obviously familiarity with cannabis use prior to surgery is a sine qua non of good anesthesiology and good medical practice overall. When we seek to examine further the nature of the risk from a cardiovascular standpoint, this seminal article on marijuana, which appeared in the New England Journal in 2014, is a fundamental reference. And what the authors of this article did was to summarize the evidence and then identify their overall level of confidence in the likelihood that the marijuana is producing certain adverse effects. And so we see that their confidence in the evidence about addiction is high, no pun intended. And it's been, if you are a daily user of marijuana, there's a 50% chance you're going to become addicted. Addicted in the classical, appropriately defined form of addiction. And up to 10% of marijuana users are predicted to become addicted. And this has obvious implications for us in our community, as potentially the use of marijuana increases very significantly. There is also medium levels of confidence in terms of some of these other consequences. And I would suggest to you that the level of confidence is probably rising in these particular areas, particularly in the area of abnormal brain development. We know that neuroplasticity continues until the age of 25 and is very dynamic through the years of late adolescence and early adulthood. And the evidence is quite substantial that the regular use of marijuana through those years has very ominous implications in terms of brain development, in terms of the likelihood of developing other significant psychotic or other substantial mental health issues. And this is an issue which our colleagues on university campuses and college campuses are now seized with, because they are seeing an explosion of mental health challenges in that particular population, and fundamental among those challenges and central to those challenges is the use of marijuana. Marijuana and binge drinking, to come back to another popular substance, are causing havoc in Canadian university and college campuses. I'm familiar with a university to the south of us that has several thousand students and had 41,000 visits to the student health services last year alone, 40% of which were for mental health issues. And marijuana and binge drinking figuring prominently in both of them, which explains why the Canadian Medical Association, in its submissions to the federal government at the time of consideration of the legalization of marijuana, was so emphatic that the age for purchasing marijuana should be 25. We know that the whole issue of diminished lifetime achievement is also very prominent among marijuana users, and you know, there are various phrases, he's a stoner, she's a stoner, that there seems to be an arrest in terms of ambition and overall achievement amongst those, potentially amongst those who are heavy users of marijuana at a low age. Very low association with lung cancer, purely on a dose response kind of exposure kind of basis. But what you do not see anywhere in this list is cardiovascular consequences. And I think that underscores the fact that there's a great deal of, may I say, ambiguity in terms of the evidence that has been acquired. Nonetheless, with the legalization of marijuana, to repeat again, we need to be much more sensitive to the fact that use of marijuana, and particularly synthetic forms of marijuana, may be the underlying cause of cardiovascular events and pathologies. A quick comment about synthetic cannabinoids. These are known in the community by such happy names as K2, Spice, Black Mamba. They're seemingly innocent herbal products is the way the usual trafficking sources and systems would describe these particular products. But they can be up to 200 times more potent than standard THC. And these are the agents that generally, or very frequently, pardon me, result in 4 or 5 14 or 15-year-olds presenting in emergency departments in acute states of emotional, mental health devastation, et cetera, et cetera. And one would hope that the legalization of marijuana will mean that these products, obtained only on the black market, will slowly disappear as a consequence of the ease with which people may find other forms of marijuana. But individuals who are using marijuana today are used to marijuana of a certain potency, and the products which will be available to them through legalization will not, in their individual quanta, necessarily have that same degree of potency. So it may be a little naive to expect that there will be a substantial transformation of purchasing purchasing behaviors, pardon me. So it's complicated. It's very complicated. Lack of data, the changing levels of THC, inability to distinguish the effects of marijuana from other substances, the fact that marijuana contains a whole array of carcinogens, etc. And intriguingly, yeah, there are some indirect effects of marijuana, changing appetite, increased body weight, diminished levels of physical activity, which themselves might ultimately contribute to cardiovascular consequences. Well, to this point, we've talked about nothing but smoking marijuana. Let's talk about ingesting marijuana, which in many respects is a very much safer way to use marijuana. As has been observed, if you toke, don't smoke, and because there are safer ways to use marijuana, ingesting marijuana being one of them. But the challenge here is that the individual who consumes marijuana does not have the opportunity or the ability to very rapidly assess the effect of marijuana. When you deliver any drug via smoking, you're delivering a drug directly into the arterial circulation, and seconds later it's in the addiction centers and other centers within the brain. So you know what's happening. And smokers of tobacco, certainly, and smokers of marijuana can titrate with exquisite precision the intake of the substances that they seek, either nicotine or marijuana, etc. When you eat something, a marijuana cookie, a marijuana brownie, a marijuana whatever, gummy bear, the effect or the impact may not be appreciated. And very typically what has happened in the past is individuals consume marijuana brownies, marijuana cookies, nothing happens. So they have some more. And nothing happens. And so they have some more. And then, wham. And so the consumption of edible marijuana products has obvious implications for issues like abilities, impairment, et cetera, because of the difficulty controlling the dose when using these products. Again, a potential advantage of a system of legalization which will make marijuana of only certain concentration available, and which will permit the manufacture and the merchandising of products that have certain concentrations of marijuana. And you will be able to recognize these particular products by these identifiers, which have now been mandated by Health Canada, the federal government, that must form the basis, that must be part of the packaging and the material in which these particular products are sold. Marijuana is metabolized basically by the liver, and THC, hydroxy-THC disappears fairly rapidly, but carboxy-THC persists for a long time, and it's stored in the fat. And so a daily marijuana user will always test positive for marijuana as a consequence of the storage of this metabolic product of THC. And that has had implications over the years in many particular settings. Some of you may remember the name Ross Rabagliati, which is a name I recall with some, what's a name I recall. And so this obviously has connotations for law enforcement agencies who probably are in the process now of applying very arbitrary levels of THC, carboxy-THC. The issue here is that regular users of marijuana who may have levels at this point are generally may not be impaired. Incidental users of marijuana who may have levels at this point are very likely to be impaired because tolerance develops to the psychotropic properties of this drug as a consequence of exposure. So some quick messages. If you don't use marijuana, why start? Many of us have got to, however many score years in 10 without marijuana and seem to have done very well, and no particular desire to rush out and be the first in the line to whatever. And I think when you're asked questions by patients who may reflect those circumstances, I think that's very good advice. If you smoke marijuana, don't smoke. Switch to vaping. Because the delivery of a drug produced by vaporization as opposed to combustion means that you're not exposing yourself to those inevitable products of combustion which can be so problematic, particularly from a cardiovascular standpoint, or if you smoke marijuana, consider switching to ingestibles. It's important that we understand the very profound implications of marijuana use by our teenage children and young adult children. We must appreciate the potential for cardiovascular issues, and certainly the synthetic cannabinoids are products to be completely eliminated, hopefully. There are other issues, however, with the legalization of marijuana. This is going to have an impact on our ability to help people stop smoking because so many people mix marijuana with tobacco and smoke tobacco throughout the day, and occasionally one of those cigarettes contains marijuana. Interestingly enough, many such users, and we see them in our smoking cessation clinic, want to stop smoking tobacco because they understand the consequences of tobacco smoking. But the likelihood of our being able to help them successfully stop smoking if they are using marijuana in this way is very low in comparison to our ability to help other smokers. The question of addiction cannot be avoided or cannot be escaped. No one wants to become addicted to a particular drug, and no one wants members of their families, their neighbors, or their community to have high levels of addiction. Impairment we'll talk about in just a second. And it's always been anticipated that the legalization of marijuana will eliminate the contraband black market marijuana and put out of business those happy people who traffic in marijuana and so many other unbelievable substances. That may be a very optimistic perspective, given the fact that it's very, very, very easy to obtain marijuana in the community today. Very easy. Marijuana of a certain degree of potency. And many of today's contemporary marijuana users, I would suspect or suggest, won't feel it necessary to find the particular store or order the particular product that they seek. And so therefore, those happy suppliers of marijuana of a certain type and certain potency will in all likelihood remain in business. The interaction and the relationship with smoking is very complex and of great significance. And I know you expected me to say that, but I'm saying that. We have seen for the first time, as a consequence, I would argue, of governmental indifference. The government said the federal government told us we're going to have a brand new reinvigorated tobacco control policy, and we're going to take advantage of the recommendations that came from the Endgame Summit, which suggested that we want to reduce smoking to less than 5% by 2035. We're not going to get anywhere close to that unless we become more resolute in addressing tobacco-related issues as the principal preventive public health challenge in our community. And you see this data which shows this particular uptick. But there's more challenging data emerging, and we'll come to that in just a second as we talk about vaping. And electronic nicotine delivery systems, ENDS, have now become commonplace in the market, and they have changed dramatically, and they have changed in a very sinister fashion in the case of one or two products, which we'll describe in a second. So the whole rationale of these devices is that you heat a solution, usually propylene glycol, which is the solution that's used to make the fog in discos and on stage shows and at rock concerts. You put some nicotine in that, you heat it, it's vaporized, you inhale the nicotine, and you're not inhaling any of the products of combustion. So from a point of view of carcinogenesis, there is a reduced risk. But the products of these devices also have an impact on a variety of other tissues. And in the haste to talk about harm reduction, many people have particularly regulatory authorities, have overlooked the fact that, yeah, cancer is a horrible consequence of smoking combustion products. And so if you switch to vaporized products, you eliminate or you dramatically reduce the risk associated with combustion. But 60% of more of the health consequences of smoking are not cancer. They're chronic respiratory disease and they're cardiovascular. And there is increasing evidence that the products of these devices pose particular risk for those with cardiovascular disease. And we'll see about that in a second. And here is the schema which talks about how products that are part of this e-cigarette aerosol can have an interaction with a whole variety of mechanisms which we know are common in terms of the genesis of cardiovascular disease, with a particular emphasis on myocardial blood flow and myocardial ischemia. So these devices are not anything like the first cigalikes, as they were called, which first appeared on the market. These are very, very sophisticated and can cost hundreds of dollars and involve all kinds of controls to increase the voltage, increase the temperature, increase your exposure to nicotine. You can buy solutions that vary in their nicotine concentration, and so you can dramatically increase the intake of nicotine. They are also virtually totally unregulated. And this is a cause for some concern. So what do we know about e-cigarettes in general? Well, yeah, there's a harm reduction potential, but that harm reduction only occurs if individuals switch exclusively to the use of these devices and forego the use of combustion tobacco products. And that doesn't seem to be happening. The overwhelming majority of e-device users become what we call dual users, with some interesting implications, as we'll see in just a second. We also know that the tobacco industry is now moving like gangbusters into this area of the marketplace, and they have no interest whatsoever in helping individuals stop smoking. And so in some respects, I would suggest that there's been a rather neglectful indifference to the emergence of these products on the part of regulatory authorities who have, I heard someone who I can't identify in a position of authority a week or so ago say, well, these aren't a tobacco problem. And all I could think about, how naive can one possibly get? And what have we forgotten in the 20 or 30 years where we made substantial progress against the use of these devices? The likelihood of a non-smoking teenager beginning to use these devices as a consequence of fascination, curiosity, whatever, has grown dramatically, as we'll see, with very sinister consequences. And those numbers have increased very substantially in most developed nations where these kinds of products are available, with obvious implications because it takes only a day or two to get addicted to nicotine. And many of these young people migrate to combustion tobacco products. More data in a second. What we see from this data provided by Dr. Robert Schwartz at the Ontario Tobacco Research Unit is that probably 65% of those who use these devices continue to smoke as much, if not more, when they are using these e-devices. And that continues as long as these individuals use these devices. And there is emerging evidence, or pardon me, there's good evidence that the use of these devices actually reduces the likelihood that an individual will make a smoking cessation attempt. And we see that from this data from CTADS, the Canadian Tobacco, Alcohol and Drug Survey, that 15% of those using e-cigarettes in the 30 days prior to this survey had never been smokers. 133,000, that's not an insignificant number when you can consider the size of this particular survey and the date at which this survey was administered. Because while governments sleep, these products have emerged in our community. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with IQOS and with Juul. But let me tell you, your teenage children are familiar, certainly, with Juul. And Juul is a very sophisticated device which delivers more nicotine than a conventional cigarette. We used to talk about the cigarette as being the most sophisticated drug delivery device in our community outside of the implantable insulin pump. Juul has supplanted that reputation. This is a very elegantly packaged, very sophisticatedly marketed product which has found particular take-up amongst teenagers across North America and elsewhere in the world. IQOS uses a heat not burn strategy in which, let's call it a tea bag containing tobacco, is heated and the vapor that is produced contains nicotine. And it too is now starting to be very aggressively marketed. IQOS is owned by a tobacco company. Juul is a company formed by two individuals, a Stanford graduate and a Harvard graduate, who said, we can figure out a way in which we can deliver massive amounts of nicotine and we can market the living daylights out of this in a very fantastic and attractive way. And boy, have they succeeded. So this article in the New England Journal on August the 22nd pointed out that the use of pod-mod e-cigarettes was becoming pandemic in the United States. And the picture on the right doesn't portray it, but it shows teenagers smoking in the, or pardon me, juuling, as they would term it, in the classroom, a phenomenon which is occurring in high schools in this city. And so Juul is a very sophisticated electronic device which heats a solution, a cartridge containing nicotine, and is available in Canada in a whole variety of flavors: cucumber, mango, peach. I'm probably neglecting a few, menthol, etc., etc., etc. But back to the story in the United States. The FDA on September the 12th, just 2 or 3 weeks after the data produced in the New England Journal of Medicine, said, we're giving these manufacturers 60 days to explain to us how they're going to stop marketing these products to kids, or we're going to take them off the market. And within a week or so, the manufacturers said, we will no longer sell flavored products. We will no longer market them to teenagers in the following kind of ways. Now, the validity and the effectiveness of that approach remains to be seen. The manufacturers of Juul in Canada did nothing. The federal government in Canada has done nothing, despite the fact that the use of these devices is growing exponentially amongst the teenage population in our community. And while this product was only introduced in Canada in September, the sales have just absolutely taken off. There are high schools in the United States where now all computer charging devices have been removed from the school, simply because you recharge these devices using that standard USB-like device. I have been in communities in Canada recently in the last few weeks where people are saying, gee, the hockey team is juuling before the game, during the game, and after the game. And kids are using these devices in our high schools. What are you guys in the smoking world doing about this? And so there's a recognition that there's a problem in our midst which really needs attention. And not yet in publication, but these are excerpts from the manuscript, and I promised on a stack of Bibles I would not show any numbers, is this work by David Hammond at the University of Waterloo, showing that there is preliminary evidence that the use of these devices with higher nicotine concentrations is now increasing the intensity and frequency of vaping. We may be spawning a new generation of smokers as a consequence of the advent of these products. And Stan Glantz, who's a very accomplished tobacco researcher, has looked carefully at the issue of e-cigarette use, particularly as it relates to myocardial infarction. And in a recent publication pointed out that the dual use of e-cigarettes and conventional cigarettes, which is very common, as we've already noted, is actually more dangerous than using either product alone. As a consequence, he suggests of some of the products which are released from these devices, which also have potential or have actual cardiovascular impacts. He wrote in another article that these devices deliver a whole array of problems that can increase cardiovascular risk, acknowledges the issue with youth, notes that the tobacco industry is marching in to occupy a very important part of this place. 93% of e-cigarette users in the United States continue to smoke. The odds of quitting are 28% lower in those who use these devices, and 25% of youth e-cigarette or e-device users would not be likely to use these to ever start smoking. So a very substantial problem, and I can only pray that Health Canada and those who have a regulatory capacity are aware of what is happening here. Go to your next gas station, and I'll guarantee you in many of your gas stations, on the pump, there will be an ad for Juul. In the convenience stores in suburban malls, you will find product display paraphernalia which rivals the power walls of the days when tobacco advertising was permitted. It's as if we've learned nothing after decades of understanding how the tobacco industry circumvents health-related regulations and rules. And the result is it could be catastrophic, quite frankly, and I exaggerate when I say that, given what we know are the inevitable consequences of tobacco addiction. Canadian smokers lose 10 years of life expectancy as a consequence of their tobacco addiction. So this is a very substantial public health issue. So to summarize, they eliminate carcinogens, but they contain compounds with respiratory and cardiovascular impact. Juul users are most common and may have additional cardiovascular risk, and there is very substantial evidence of increasing rates of adolescent smoking, inextricably tied to the degree to which in a few months products have come into the marketplace which have captured the attention and the purchasing power of teenagers today. So I leave you there to suggest that the transformation that is occurring as a result of the times having been changed mean that there are particular challenges for us. There are particular opportunities. There are research opportunities galore in trying to assess the cardiovascular impact of marijuana use, and we are well equipped in our setting to be able to address this. But there are also very substantial public policy challenges. And once again, I think the health community and health organizations can play a very powerful role in advocating for the public policy instruments which will be necessary to control an existing epidemic and an epidemic which is now emerging in our midst. Unfortunately, the tobacco industry has been unparalleled in terms of its ability to subvert enlightened or imaginative public policy in terms of the regulation of their products. If 47,000 people a year were dying in aircraft accidents in Canada, do you think our federal government would be doing anything about it? If 47,000 people a year were dying as the consequence of the use of other consumer products, would we be, talking about slogans and education programs and so on? No. It's unbelievable to me that tobacco and tobacco-related products have withstood and escaped any form of the kind of regulations which in an enlightened, intelligent community we would apply on products which are obviously and incredibly dangerous. So public policy changes. The times, they are a-changing. Unless we're aware of these kinds of changes and their implications, we will, in the words of Bob Dylan, sink like a stone. And I don't want to sink like a stone. Thank you very much for the invitation and for your attention.